Good evening and welcome. And this is the first episode of On the Line of 2026. And I'm delighted that we can welcome back Dilip Sarkar, who's going to be talking about a book he wrote a while ago, but we'll get into that at the moment because this is a new updated version. Before we start talking to Dilip, just want to say a massive shout out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. And as usual, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will endeavour to, or rather Dilip will endeavour to answer as many of those questions as possible. Dilip, lovely to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
So, a Spitfire story, the updated version. And
Yeah,
you
very
just
much
told
so.
me in our little preamble, this book is where it all began for you. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd always been completely invested in the Second World War, growing up in the 1960s, but this provided an opportunity for it to become tangible. And it came about really purely by accident because I was a very, very, very young policeman then. And just before I joined the police, I dabbled a little bit in aviation archaeology with Andy Long, very good friend of mine, still is. And but it wasn't particularly serious because I didn't have a great deal of time. And then when I joined the police, I was posted away. So that was the end of that. And I didn't see Andy for a little while. But then they sent me to work in Malvern, which is a beautiful place where the hills are. But back in 1985, it was a bit like Heartbeat, the old program. It was literally like that. I mean, Malvern, policing wise, was about 600 years behind everywhere else. I mean, it was amazing. And I thought, well, I'm not very impressed with this. And I was doing a very boring policing job and bumped into Andy, who I hadn't seen for a while. And Andy said, did you know that a Spitfire crashed just outside Malvern? Polish Battle of Britain pilot, engine fire, bailed out, survived, but he was missing in action over the Channel 6 months later. And it was absolutely like this. Ping! That's my light bulb moment. That is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And it was just absolutely like that. That we're going to find out with the aircraft crash. We're going to excavate whatever's left to conserve it and exhibit it and tell a story. And we're going to interview the eyewitnesses. We're going to trace pilots who flew it and piece the story together. And we then set up the Malvern Spitfire team, as was, and brought together a few other like-minded people to help us with the project. Put an appeal in the local paper, got inundated with eyewitnesses contacting us. And it was a fantastic story anyway. And it was absolutely, it was a huge snowball. It was massive. It became, I remember somebody saying to me about a couple of years later, do you know, I picked up the Malvern Gazette today and there's nothing about flipping Spitfires in it. He says, that's got to be the first time for bloody years. That's the impact it had, and it was something that not only, it massively inspired us, the story of this young Polish pilot and everybody else who'd flown the aircraft, but it inspired everybody. It just captured people's imagination. And it was wonderful. And eventually, I think we had to wait 18 months before we could actually do the dig because of crop rotation. Or something like that. But and in that time, the snowball got even bigger because we decided that we would make it into a public excavation. I mean, can you imagine today all the hassle you're going to have with health and safety and insurance and God knows what? It would be a nightmare to organise something like that. But we set it up as a public event to raise money for the RAF Benevolent Fund, the Wings Appeal. Organised to do it in September, Battle of Britain time. Battle of Britain Memorial flight was scheduled to attend. Ultimately, they cancelled because of the weather, which was disappointing. But we did have a 56 Squadron Tornado that was amazing, a GR1. But virtually the whole of Worcestershire must have turned up to this, which we were not anticipating. It was amazing. And we built a small granite cairn in memory of Francis Exuma, the pilot. not because he was killed there, but because he was missing. We just felt that it would be nice locally to remember him, you know, and it was built at the roadside, close to where he landed by parachute, about 150 yards away from the field where the Spitfire crashed. And it was unveiled by two Polish Battle of Britain pilots, Ludwik Martel and Gandhi Jabinski. And as we left, we sort of announced over the tannoy that the memorial was going to be unveiled, and people just left the field in droves, and we thought they were going home. And then we were with got the local air cadets and various other people, and we sort of formed up to walk the short distance up the lane. And Gandhi Jabinski said to me, Dilip, in 1945, we were told not to attend the big victory parade in London because of Stalin. He said, this is our victory parade. Thank you. We've waited a long time for this. And I mean, it was just so moving. And as we rounded the corner in the lane, it was like wall to wall people. It was absolutely packed. There must have been hundreds of people there, literally hundreds and hundreds of people. It was the most moving experience in my life, I can tell you. It was so unexpected. And the Poles, they were absolutely blown away that all these people had turned out, you know, to pay their respects to this Polish pilot. And at the time, it was the first memorial to an individual Polish airman. And yeah, it was unveiled, and we then had the bits and pieces identified and conserved, and they went into an exhibition at a museum in Worcester, and they were then made into a traveling exhibition. I think it was something like, I don't know how many thousands of people attended the exhibition. I can't remember the numbers now, but it was staggering. Absolutely unexpected for us. And you know, as we discussed before the pod started, I think I was about 24 or 25, and Andy was probably 18 or 19 when we started this. And we were only kids, really. We've never done anything like this. We weren't connected to any museum or any university. We had no resources except for what was in our own pockets, no sponsors, nothing. We did it all ourselves. And I'm very proud of that. It was an incredible thing to do. And it really did define the rest of my, well, and Andy's life. I mean, you know, Andy is a historian. His book about the Bolton Pool Defiant is out this year at last. He spent years and years and years and years working on it. And it's going to be a great thing when that comes out, which will be his second book. So it absolutely defined our life. And that was it. That's what happened.
Well, I could ask you so many questions on that, just on that story. And you've told me part of this already, and I've already asked questions before we started. So there's a few things in there. First of all, I mean, a remarkable achievement. So well done. And, you know, obviously, I think the right thing to do. I think everybody in the audience would agree with that. Am I right in thinking, and this is a multiple question, right in thinking that we didn't commemorate the service perhaps of should we say, the non-British participants of the Battle of Britain at the time, particularly from Eastern Europe? And was that, obviously Poland was still behind the Iron Curtain at this time? Yeah. So how did you go about researching it? And indeed, how did the Polish pilots even find out about it?
Well, so that's a very expansive question, to use a line out of the film Layer Cake, which is one of my favorite films.
Good film.
And if we track that, but let's track that back the other way. So let's start today. So today we have, you know, a much bigger Polish community in the UK than we had 40 years ago. Poland is no longer behind the Iron Curtain. So today, and the Poles rightly are very proud of their ancestors who fought in the Second World War, and there's great, you know, efforts to commemorate that and celebrate it. Really, commemorate and celebrate, you know, both the same thing. And it's overt. It is as overt as a rock concert, and it's that loud. This you know, this Polish nationalism almost. I cannot tell you how different it was 40 years ago. You know, the Polish community kept a very low profile, and that was because those that went home were persecuted, who fought for the West in the Second World War.
Yeah.
The Czechs as well, the Czechoslovak pilots, a terrible time. You know, I mean, Stanislav Skalski, one of the most famous Polish pilots, you know, was imprisoned and terrible things. And Kajek Budzik, who I got to know extremely well, who lived in Nottingham, he said at the end of the war, his father and his brother, they'd both been murdered during the Katyn massacre of the Polish officer corps by the Soviets. And, you know, his mother said, under no circumstances come home. So he stayed here. And they did. They kept a very low profile because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, to the detriment of their families still behind the Iron Curtain.
Of course.
So it was a completely different situation during the Cold War. And that then meant, you know, that is the reason why there was a dearth of information about Polish pilots, Czechoslovak pilots, you know, in particular. And that is really, well, that is the reason. And there was the Polish Institute at Prince's Gate, it used to be in London. And, you know, they were just incredibly, I think they were just astonished that we were so interested. And you know, they had lots and lots of information that we couldn't have accessed anywhere else. You know, records about these pilots, and they were very helpful. The Polish Air Force Association in Great Britain, which no longer exists, they were very helpful. And in fact, I was made an honorary Pole at a big ceremony at the Polish Air Force Association headquarters in London, with Air Vice Marshal Meissner and several Polish Battle of Britain pilots. And we did enough drink some vodka that day, I'll tell you. God.
It's a qualification, I think, for being a pilot.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Grey Goose it was as well. It was good stuff, you know. Yeah, so it was very different. So when the Poles themselves, the pilots, you know, I suppose they must have been in their 70s then, I guess, or perhaps actually no, they were probably about the same age I am now, kind of approaching mid-60s or a little bit older maybe. It's 40 years ago, isn't it? Blimey. So if they were alive now, yeah, they'd probably be 105. Yeah, they'd probably be 60s. God, that's scary, because I thought they were really old at the time. Blimey,
let's not dwell on that, Dilip.
No, that is scary, isn't it? But that, yeah, I mean, they were just wonderful people, and they were just so astonished that we were so passionately driven to commemorate all this, you know. And they just took everybody, I think, took us to their hearts and helped us. You know,
I think that's because, I mean, obviously it hadn't been recognized, and this, like we said, you know, you said this was your moment and this is what you wanted to do, but obviously something magical happened when you decided to do this and put your plan into action. It's almost like that lack of recognition since the war and up until that point really contributed to the success of it, because at last people were able
to definitely, yeah, absolutely. That is definitely true, because I remember, you know, a lot of the RAF veterans, you know, the British veterans, if you like, you know, they were so respectful of the Poles, so respectful, and you know, and so pleased that they were getting this kind of recognition. And I remember, you know, I mean, before the pod started, we were talking a bit about fishing, which is my other massive passion, pike and carp fishing, and always has been. But when we were kids, you know, we were about, I don't know, 14 or 15 scallies, you know, and there was this salmon angler on the River Team at Powick near Worcester, where we used to fish, near where we lived, Zenon Sharko. I can picture him now, and he hated us, absolutely hated us, because I don't know why, really. He just didn't like kids, I suppose. And we were down the river all the time. We were fanatics, you know. And one day he did something to upset one of my friends. So they sneaked up behind where he was fishing and threw a load of bricks in his swim and then ran off, you know. Well, anyway, many years later, when we did this project, I got a letter off Zenon Sharko. he obviously didn't realize, I was one of these flipping kids. It was a pain in the box, when we were young. Just saying, I think what you've done is absolutely fantastic. I can't thank you enough for, putting the poles on the map and da 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 da. Anyway, it turned out he'd only been Polish special forces, parachuted into Yugoslavia to train Tito's partisans. Well, Christ, thank God he didn't catch us. Mother of God. So, the kind of point from that little funny story is that these people were out there. You had no idea what they'd done. They never talked about it, only to themselves within their own little communities. Kajek Bujic, who didn't fly that particular Spitfire R6644, but he was on the squadron and he was flying the day that Franek Surma was killed. It was a disaster. It was our last operation of 1941, and 16 Spitfires were lost that day. It was just an absolute fiasco, variety of reasons. But Kajek Bujic, considering his father and his brother were officers in the pre-war Polish army, that means they were posh. They were proper upper middle class Polish people. And after the war, he became a bus driver in Nottingham. And his wife Helen was a Polish WAF, and they set up shop in Long Eaton in Nottingham and had a family, and they doted on their grandkids, and they lived in a little semi up there, and I used to go up there, and they were just beautiful people. They were, they weren't particularly well off, but the welcome was so warm, so incredibly generous, and hospitable, and he said, we just forgot all about the war afterwards, and I think they all did. You've got other priorities, you've got new careers to get on with, you've got families to raise, you've got responsibilities, and the war was just something that happened, and it's not your whole life, is it? Life moves on.
Well, I think very much people try to forget what they probably spent,
absolutely
the
right,
best years of their life, the younger years. I mean, it wouldn't have been easy for many, would it, at all?
Absolutely. One of the first things I ever wrote was an article for I think the magazine was called Wingspan. It doesn't exist anymore. But I did an article about Kajek Bujic called From Spitfire to Skoda, because he drove this ropey old Skoda. And I just couldn't get over it. He was a little wiry guy, Kajek, massive personality, fantastic bloke. I just can't tell you, and as sprightly as you like. And I remember when he was about 80, I said, "What are you up to?" He said, I'm doing some driving for the old folks." He's 80, brilliant. And when we did the book launch for the original book, he was guest of honor, and you couldn't keep him out of the Spitfire that was outside. They're not easy to get into, You've got to climb up on the wing, you've got to, step up onto the side of the cockpit and onto the seat, and then lower yourself down by holding around the windscreen, and not easy. And this guy's about 80, and he was as sprightly as you like. I mean, he was absolute dynamo, this guy. And his Gandhi Jabinski, who was one of the pilots who unveiled our memorial, he was Battle of Britain pilot. He shot up Adolf Galland actually in 1941 over the Pas de Calais, and was an ace DFC and all of this, and ultimately became commander of 303 Squadron when they had P-51 Mustangs in 1945. And Bujic was one of his flight commanders, but they'd not seen each other since 1945. And in 1988, when we opened our exhibition in Worcester, Bujic must have been staying with me, and Gandhi Jabinski was staying with my parents. But Gandhi came over to Malvern, to my house, and we didn't tell Bujic that he was coming. And it was just fantastic. I mean, it was just two blokes just hanging on to each other, sobbing, and everybody else just kind of faded away and went into another part of the house. It was just amazing.
Well done, you. But this Spitfire has many other pilots, doesn't it? And
Very
do you know
much
what?
so. It's a
I had a
fun,
quick,
yeah,
had a quick glance because this has only turned up today, as I was saying earlier,
yeah,
so I've
yeah.
not had any chance to read it. But I was really, really surprised. In my head, my inexperienced head, you sort of go for the film version where each pilot has their own Spitfire, and that's it. Nothing could be further from the truth, could it?
No, not really. I mean, the senior pilots did on the squadrons, but I mean, um, this Spitfire, in a way, the Spitfire itself had quite an unremarkable, undistinguished history. It was test flown by Jeffrey Quill, the chief Supermarine test pilot, who I came to know as a result of this project. What a lovely man! What a lovely man! Um, and then it went to 5 operational training unit at Aston Down near Stroud, and what a story that is. I mean, unfortunately, the 5 operational training unit records don't detail flights. So the squadron records do. You've got time up, time down, serial number of the aircraft usually, and what the sortie was. So that's okay. But in terms of its time at 5 OTU, I can't produce a list of who flew it. The only way to identify those pilots was to make a list of the pilots who've been posted into the training unit during the time that the Spitfire was there, and then try and find them. Now, most of them had gone on to fly in the Battle of Britain. So Battle of Britain pilots are quite easy to find out about, because back in those days, the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, the survivors, most of the survivors were members. Wing Commander Pat Hancock, who was the secretary, was a great friend and supporter, and used to forward my letters to them, and me pestering people, asking them to check their logbook to see if there was a flight in this aircraft. And we identified some that way. 1 or 2 casualties logbooks turned up with R6644 in it, so we knew that they'd flown it as well. And very interestingly, one of the most classic memoirs from the time is The Last Enemy by Richard Hillary. And Hillary was there at the time R6644 was there. And in the book, he writes about a bit of rivalry going on with him and Noel Agazarian, about flying under the old Severn Railway Bridge over the Bristol Channel. And they did. And it's quite possible that one or the other could have done it in R6644. And in fact, on my desk, I even have pieces of it that was presented to me at the original book launch in 1992. So whether that flew under the Severn Bridge, I don't know. But and I remember one of the survivors was Air Vice Marshal David Scott Malden. And I remember writing to him about it, and he said we used to fly under the Severn Bridge when we were reasonably safe from retribution right at the end of the course, but nobody would obviously ever record it in their logbook.
Yep.
And he said he watched his great friend George Barclay, who was later killed in the desert, decided it would be possible to fly a Spitfire under the bridge, but under one of the smaller arches, which meant he had to take the Spitfire through at a 45-degree angle. So the rest of them sort of held off watching this, and Barclay comes belting down the River Severn, whacks it into a 45-degree angle, and shoots through one of the small arches on the Gloucester side. Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
What a story. So all that was going on when it was at 5 OTU. But if you actually read the list of pilots posted in during the period it was there, it reads like a roll call of the lost, because so many of them were killed in the Battle of Britain and afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
and they're kids, aren't they? I mean, it's really, really tragic. So it was damaged at Aston Down, a landing accident, so it had to go away to be repaired. And from there, it went to 616 Squadron that was rebuilding after the Battle of Britain, because 616 Squadron got absolutely battered, virtually annihilated, flying from Kenley over just a 2-week period. And they were at Curtin in Lindsey, up in Lincolnshire, rebuilding, taking on new pilots and providing them extra training. That's when it was flown by people like Hugh Dundas, who was, ultimately one of the youngest group captains in the service. Group Captain Sir Hugh Dundas, and whose brother was John Dundas, who shot down the German ace Helmut Vick off the Isle of Wight, and was then shot down himself by Rudy Flans, Vick's wingman. They all ended up in the Solent missing. And the 616 Squadron story brings in people like Billy Burton, who was the CO, and they all went down afterwards, down to Tangmere, when Barder was wing leader down at Tangmere, and everything. Oh, it's just, the stories are just amazing. So after 616, and 616 was difficult because the 616 operations records book is really bad, and that lists flights, but it doesn't tell you who the pilots are. So that's not very helpful, and it doesn't give you the aircraft serial numbers either. So again, the only way you could identify pilots was by tracing survivors, getting them to check their logbook, tracing the families of casualties, and the same kind of thing. So then we go to 65 Squadron, when 616 went down to Tangmere and relieved 65, and they exchanged Spitfires, so that 65 were operating the new Mark IIs, and R6644 was a bit of a clapped out old Mark 1A by that time. So 65 take 616's Spitfires up to Curtin and Lindsey, and that's when it's flown by the great ace Paddy Finnegan, the Irish ace. What a story. One 21-year-old wing commander at Kenley, shot down by ground fire off the 2K, goes into the sea, never seen again. Tragic. And Paddy Finnegan flew it. And a number of other very, very interesting people. Ron Stilwell, who survived, lovely bloke. Yeah, absolutely fantastic stories. And then after 65 Squadron, it goes to the Poles, to 308 City of Krakow Squadron, which was a new squadron, and they formed on battles and then hurricanes, and then they were changing over to Spitfires at Baggington near Coventry, which is when Surma flew it. And we were able to, it was about 5 Polish pilots flew it, I think, altogether, until on the 11th of May 1941, Surma has this engine fire over Malvern and tips it upside down and drops out, over the fields between Malvern and the village of Callow End. So the thing about that aircraft is you might think that to write about a Spitfire, it's got to be one that's had lots of combat and all this sort of stuff, but it hasn't really, because the subtitle of the book is The Invisible Thread. And that came from I had 2 forwards written to the original book, one by Sahu Dundas and one by Gandhi Drabinsky. And it was something that Gandhi said. He said that the Spitfire was the invisible thread that brought all these other threads together, which are all the stories of the different pilots, and so it goes on. On the cover of the book, the pilot on the extreme left, Peter Mitchell, I was in Calcutta recently in October, and he's buried in Calcutta in Bhawanipur Cemetery, where there's about 1,000 British war graves in there, actually. And he was killed in a flying accident in a hurricane near Dum Dum, which is Calcutta, Subhash Chandra Bose International now. So I went to photograph his grave over there. So it's still going on. The research for this, and the story, it's amazing thing. So that's it. It's to me, the Spitfire is like a tree trunk, and all the interesting bits are all the branches that come out of it.
So do you think you unearth stories that you wouldn't have done? Because it's a slightly different approach, isn't it? Rather than having a list of names of, say, the few and researching those as individuals, I'm guessing there were a lot more aircraft than there were pilots, as we know. So does it give you a different research angle, a different approach to looking at these stories and discovering stories?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And because this isn't like, say you were going to research a famous pilot, which I have, like, written novels about Barder. warts and all books, not romanticized flipping Paul Brickhill stuff. Or Johnny Johnson, who was my great friend and mentor, So then you're talking about a specific person. This is slightly different because you're coming at it, it's about them. You don't want them to talk about a famous person, you want them to talk about them. And the problem with that is they'll all talk about everybody else and what heroes everybody else you know, heroics got up to, but never about themselves.
Yeah.
So, you know, but I think the advantage I had was I was a professional interviewer, you know, in the
As a
police. I
policeman.
was a detective.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know how to speak to people and how to win their trust and get them to talk to me. So, and I think it was also, the whole thing was about timing. Because thinking about it now, they must have been about mid 60s or a little bit more, so about my age. And I can't tell you how scary that is, actually. But I think for the first time, a lot of them had got time, having just retired, to actually sit down and reflect and start thinking about this. Now, a lot of them never spoke to their own children about their wartime experiences, and I think there was a bit of a disconnect, wasn't there, between a lot of wartime survivors and their children who didn't want to know, but
Oh, absolutely.
don't
I mean, you
mention the
think of
war.
the baby boomers you're talking about, and they're starting from the very, very different world, and
Yeah,
you know,
completely. You know,
30s.
the
So,
1960s
yeah.
and all of that. You know, trying to get as far away from that military, regimented austerity, you know, as they possibly could. So, and then I come along, and I'm interested, passionately interested. And over a period of time, I'd accumulated a fair bit of knowledge. And my interest isn't in the ins and outs of and that's what's it about what carburetor a Spitfire had. To be honest with you, I don't care. You know, I do have to know about that stuff, obviously, but it's people I'm interested in. It's people's stories and that human experience of war and of being part of something bigger than you, being part of history, you know. So and I remember, you know, I think it was the first time they'd actually spoken to a younger person about it. And I remember going to see, and Andy was with me, remember this. We went to see George Unwin, who was one of my heroes of all time. George was a tough Yorkshire miner's son, had the good fortune to go to grammar school, joined the Royal Air Force as a clerk, and then made the quantum leap from clerk to fighter pilot under the 1936 expansion plan, and ultimately became a flight sergeant, the high priest of 19 Squadron, they called him, at Falmere, flying Spitfires, one of Fighter Command's most aggressive pilots in the Battle of Britain, beyond a doubt, was
Why was
attacked
he called
by...
that? How High Priest, Dilip? Where did that name come from?
They just called him the High Priest because that was his kind of attitude, you know. I mean, George was in charge, you know.
Right. Okay.
I mean, that was it. It was like such like a sergeant major, isn't it? You know, and George was tough, really tough. You know, only a little guy again, you know, but massive personality. And I remember going to see him, and we were talking. I was researching what became my first published book, which was about Brian. It was inspired by Brian Lane, who was the commanding officer, who was 23 at the time of the Battle of Britain. Very famous photograph of him with the 1,000-yard stare that fascinated me as a child. And so, anyway, the first time I met George and I went to see him, and we were talking about something, and I managed to settle a dispute between George and his wife because she was saying to me, "What a load of rubbish," she said. George told me they were off to France in 1939 and all of this, so we had to get married. And she said, "I wouldn't have married him. I didn't think he'd come back from France." So I thought, well, I might as well marry him and just have done with him, you know, because he just keeps on and on and on. She said, they never went to France. They weren't going to France. I said, as a matter of fact, they were. Yeah, they were. Lee Mallory, 12 Group commander, trying to get 12 Group into the battle, did want to send his Spitfires to France, which Dowding was having none of because he didn't send any Spitfires to France. So I managed to settle about a 50-year-old sort of dispute between them. But the thing was that he said he was talking animatedly about somebody. I forget who it was now. And he was telling us, and he said, "Come on, Dilip, come on, you remember him. You remember him. What was his name?" And I said, "It's Johnny Petrie, but I don't remember him, George. I wasn't there, you know." And that was a wonderful moment, that
Yeah.
was. I'll
Yeah.
never forget that. Wonderful moment.
Do you think any of them struggled with their experiences? You know,
Oh,
because that time
definitely.
when you've got time to reflect as well can be, when you've got time on your hands to think about things, it can be difficult, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I met another really, oh, Ron Rayner was just just such a gentle man, and he was a jeweler after the war, you know, a watchsmith, whatever you call it, you know. And he 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 was a gentle man, but he flew Spitfires from 1941 right through to the end of the war, and flew in the Barder wing and the Tangmere wing in 1941, was shot up and crash landed at Hawkinge, and then later went to North Africa, and was part of the Sicilian and Italian campaigns. And of course, by then the war was changing, and it became, for the Spitfire pilots, a lot more about flying in close support of the army,
Mm.
uh, air to ground cooperation, rather than sort of the big dogfights or big air actions of the Battle of Britain. All those days were over. And I remember Ron saying to me the one day, he was one of my tea stops when I was in the police in Malvern, and he said, do you know, he said, there's not a day gone past when I haven't thought about what we did, what we've done. He said, when you're strafing columns of troops
Mm.
and you're actually seeing the effect of your fire, which he said you don't see when you're shooting at an aeroplane. You're shooting at a machine. But he said, I got visions in my head, you know, of seeing people on fire and seeing just long lines of soldiers falling over as I'm firing at them. And then in 1941, they had these desperate things, rhubarb operations, which were to fly very, very low across the channel and then pop up over the French coast and shoot up anything that moved. And they were called rhubarbs because they had to fly so low to avoid detection by radar, that they said they were down amongst the rhubarb, and the Germans would never understand that. So they were codenamed rhubarb. But, you know, and Ron was saying, I remember one day we shot up a car. He said, how could we be sure, moving at 300 miles an hour at like 200 feet, that that was a German staff car? How could we be sure? He
Mm.
said, what if it was the local doctor on his rounds? He said, oh, it's never a day's gone by.
Yeah,
Never.
you'd question everything, wouldn't you?
You
Probably.
would.
Yeah.
And there's another pilot who I was very close to. I won't mention his name, but he was an 18-year-old, 19-year-old Hurricane pilot in the Battle of Britain, survived being shot down, bailed out, and then the following year was shot down over France, crash landed a Spitfire, and was captured. And he was a very, very funny man. Very funny man. Very popular guest at all of my big events and book signings back in the day. And the one evening, this would be 20 years ago now, 21 years ago maybe, he rang me up out of the blue. He said, are you still doing that research into SS war criminals? I said, yeah, on and off. I've been doing it for years and still am. Don't know whether I'll ever do anything with it. It's so depressing, to be honest.
Mm.
And then he just had an absolute rant because he was in Stallard Luff 3, and he said they were playing footballer one day and the ball went over the line into the no man's land between the wire and the big fence, you know. And he said his mate, who was a Russian POW, jumped over the wire to get the ball and a guard shot him dead. And he said this guard was an absolute sadist. He said, if you want to find anybody, you find that, you know. And
Yeah.
it was so out of character. And then a week later, I had a call from his daughter. And as soon as I used to get a son or a daughter on the phone, I knew what had happened. You know, they were ringing to tell me that they died. And he died, but he hadn't just died, he committed suicide.
Oh my gosh.
And that would have been, I don't know how old he would have been, late 70s, I suppose then. You know,
That's
there
quite
were a
unusual at
couple.
that age as well, isn't it? That is unusual.
Terrible. And there's another pilot who flew that Spitfire in the book who shot himself shortly after the war, actually, or in the late 50s or 60s. And I think that some of them also, I knew one pilot in particular who had survivor guilt, and it was pronounced survivor guilt, you know. And when I did the 8-volume Battle of Britain official history, uh, and that was a forensic piecing together of just about every single action that was ever fought in the Battle of Britain, I discovered that that particular pilot shot down a Hurricane, and the pilot was killed. It's one of those things, isn't it? Friendly fire.
Mm.
But his description in his combat report of what happened to this Hurricane, because the Hurricane pilot tried to force land and it all went wrong and he was killed. There's no question about it. I know exactly who he shot down. And I absolutely am 100% convinced that he knew. He didn't know when he was pressing the trigger, but he certainly knew afterwards. And I think that's why he suffered from that pronounced survivor guilt. I'm no psychologist, but it seems pretty obvious to me.
Affects people in different ways, doesn't it? I think it's interesting when you talk about, people taking their own lives, because we don't normally associate that with as much with the Second World War, do we? Especially at that late age.
Well, that's right. And another thing to remember, is my own maternal grandfather was a grenadier, Bert Smith, and it's him up on the wall behind me, actually. And he was wounded and captured 21st of May 1940 at a little place called Escalnes in Belgium on the River Escaut. Massive battle there. Funnily enough, I wrote a book about it in 1999, and I've just completely rewritten and updated that. That's out this year soon. And his mate won a Victoria Cross, Harry Nichols, one of the first Victoria Crosses of the Second World War. And they were both captured, and they were in Stalag 20B for the rest of the war, and my granddad would never talk about it. He was traumatized by it. He was quite reclusive, actually, and he just retired. He just lived in the country. He was a market gardener. He didn't bother anybody, and nobody bothered him, and you'd never get him talking about the war. And I became very aware that when you're talking to these people about such experiences, you're not asking people about the holidays, are you?
No, not at all.
When you're asking them to get their old photograph album out, they're not holiday snaps, and they're snaps of people. It's like the cover of a Spitfire story. This is a very famous photo of 65 Squadron at Tangmere, and Sergeant Orchard was killed the day after, shot down and killed over France the day after. Peter Rose bailed out of a PRU Spitfire over Belgium and his parachute didn't open. He was killed. Paddy Finnegan there, who we were talking about earlier, he was killed. Peter Mitchell was killed at Dum Dum. And you're looking at maybe the survivors. The only survivors there were Hugh Chalmers, who I knew well, and Wig from New Zealand. They get their pictures out. What are they thinking when they're looking at that picture?
Yeah.
About the people that didn't make it. And I was very, very, very sensitive to that, about how to approach this, and I didn't find many of them who were in any shape or form gung-ho. Only one, Johnny Johnson. I mean, Johnny just loved the war, I think, and everything that went with it. But I suppose to become the top scoring fighter pilot, you've got to be a bit like that, really.
Cut from a different cloth.
Yeah, I think so. Johnny was a, yeah, I mean, Johnny was very tough guy. A massive personality, huge, enormous, fill the room with it, Yeah, Johnny was just in a different class or league altogether, completely. But yeah, it taught me a lot as quite a young man. And to be fair, I mean, I was in the police for 22 years before I left to write full time and everything. And from my own experiences, my wife was a detective chief inspector, and worked on countless murders and goodness knows what awful things. And I certainly saw some very awful things, particularly we're talking about suicides. And when I worked in Malvern, we used to get a lot of suicides there because of the lonely car parks in the hills at night, and we used to find the sort of aftermath of all of this in the morning on early turn, or the dog walkers would. And I was talking about something today. I was fishing with a friend of mine this morning and talking about a drowning that I dealt with a long time ago. But these things still stay with you. But it's not party conversation. It's not really stuff I want to remember. Seeing people with the brains blown out and hanging from trees, I don't want to think about that. So I think, having had that experience myself from the age of 21 when I joined the police, I think that helped me understand a little bit that you've got to treat this with great sensitivity and let them talk about what they want to talk about, and not pry too much, because we've got the official record. So we've got the combat reports, the after action reports, and all that sort of stuff. And they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about the good stuff, the funny stuff. And I think that was great, because the kind of after every action they had to write a report. So we've got all of those, thousands and thousands of them at the National Archives. So we've got all that information anyway. But what they would talk about, some of the funny stuff that happened, that's what we hadn't got. So that helps enrich the tapestry very much,
And I think also that time to reflect on them as well, and think about and how you want to talk about it as much as anything else. And it's about building relationships with people, isn't it? And trust.
It is, yeah. And I knew them for a long time in the end, and it got very depressing when they started to fall off the perch, at quite a rate. And I was often asked to speak at funerals, and that became very depressing period in the sort of I suppose late 90s, and sort of early 2000s, and well, no, longer than that. So that went on for quite a long time. And I remember speaking at George's funeral, George Unwin's funeral. That was really sad. And so it's been quite a thing to have actually known them the way that I did as friends, and that was a remarkable thing considering the difference in our age.
Yeah, they just background, they sort of experiences. Yeah. Cool. Thank you for that, Dilip. We've got some questions here, so let's.
Okay, go ahead.
Ron says, "What a fab subject! I'm 74 now. I made Spitfire models and drew pictures of it as a boy. Does it mean so much to us? Why does it mean so much to us Brits? Does it mean anything to other folks around the world too?"
Oh yeah, it does, definitely. I'm thinking particularly, the Poles for a start, and the Czechs, and the Australians. The Australian Spitfire Association is alive and well, run by Jeff Zuber, whose father was a Spitfire pilot. No, I think it does. I think the Spitfire was operated by so many different nationalities during the war and afterwards, and the Spitfire is the icon. And it's become a symbol, I think, of British excellence in engineering, excellence in aeronautics, excellence in courage, and everything. It is the symbol, isn't it? What's the first aircraft over the Palace at a special occasion? Spitfire and Hurricane, followed by the Lancaster. Absolutely. I mean, the Spitfire just occupies this unique place in our psyche, that it is absolutely embedded into the national narrative.
It's transcended that original role, hasn't it, in many ways?
Oh, well, when you think that R.J. Mitchell died at the age of 42 before the war, having seen the Spitfire fly in 1936, but had no idea of what was going to happen. I mean, let us not forget the unsung hero of the Spitfire story, Joe Smith, who took over after Mitchell died, the development of the aircraft. So he actually oversaw the Spitfire's development through 24 operational marks until it was taken out of service. And it was a very different aeroplane by the time it left service to the little Mark 1 or the K5054 prototype, a massive Griffin engine and a different shape, really. The wings look pretty much the same, but the rest of it's quite different. A much bigger aeroplane as well. So the Spitfire is just unique. There's nothing like it. Absolutely nothing like it. You know, we hear a lot about the Hurricane, rightly so. I did a gig at Brooklands Museum in November to a capacity crowd of 200, talking about Hurricane pilots in the Battle of Britain. We had a fun evening. It was a great evening, and people asked me this then. You know, why is the Spitfire? Well, one of the reasons is because the Spitfire was a winner from the outset, because it came off the back of the Schneider Trophy races.
Mm.
And the Schneider Trophy races, racing seaplanes, became a matter of huge patriotism and national pride between the competing nations. And we won. R.J. Mitchell's team won with the S6, and which set lots of records, the S6B, the S6, and so on. So, you know, the Spitfire arose from that. So it's a winner straight away, isn't it? In a way that the Hurricane wasn't. And then the Hurricane, by the time the Hurricane flew, it was obsolete because the ME-109 had got high altitude capacity and it was faster. That is significant.
Yeah.
So the Spitfire was as fast and also had a high altitude capacity. So after the Battle of Britain, when the Hurricane had done such great service, and the Hurricane went on to do great service all over the world in every theatre as a tank buster and so on and so forth, but it was withdrawn by spring of 1941 as our frontline fighter and completely replaced with the Spitfire. So going forward, the Spitfire, you know, it was all about Spitfires.
Yeah. All
about Spitfires in terms of the fighters, you know. I mean, no, we had the Typhoon and Tempest and so on and so forth. But you know, that's it. Every sector station, Tangmere, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Kenley, etc. You know, they all from spring 41 onwards boasted a 3-squadron strong wing of Spitfires. So the Spitfire absolutely was everywhere during the Second World War. You know, and there were 22,000 of them built. It's a lot of airplanes, isn't it?
That's an awful lot of airplanes.
It's a lot of airplanes. And so, today, let us not forget how many. I mean, I'm more interested in the Second World War, to be honest, than the warbird movement today. You know, it's not. It is of interest, but I don't keep up with how many Spitfires are flying today anymore. I mean, there's just so many of them, and at the end of the day, most of them, they're kind of modern production Spitfires, aren't they?
Mm.
These days, and I've no idea. Somebody tell me how many there is. 60 odd, something like that. I've no. If somebody said there was 100, there may well be. I have no idea. There seems to be a new one being test flown every month. You know,
that tells its own story as well.
Of course it does, but it's also because the Spitfire is easy to build today. I've been told this by people who build them. You know, it is quite straightforward to build now, being all metal and so on and so forth. Yeah, quite easy. But yeah, and that is another reason, though, that the Spitfire story, the Spitfire legend goes on, because there are Spitfires all over the place. When I was a kid, you know, I've got a picture here actually on my wall. I was 8 years old, I think, when I actually got to see a Spitfire for the first time. I've made models of them since I was about 5, but it was at Little Rissington Air Show, and there it was, P7350, which is one of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flights aircraft that was actually a Battle of Britain Spitfire, and Ludwig Martel was shot up in it. And it was an event, if ever you saw a Spitfire. And the only ones you would see were the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. And I remember watching them fly over Worcester randomly. I don't know what they were doing. The Lancaster Spitfire Hurricane. Wow, what a sight, what a sound. Incredible. But now, I mean, they're zipping all over the place. I was out walking with Sue. We were up at somewhere by the Severn estuary, and I could hear this noise. I thought, that's a Spitfire. We don't see Spitfires down here. You go down south, down by Beachy Head, and they're over Beachy Head all the time by the Seven Sisters, and, you know, these two-seater things.
They're flying out of Goodwood over.
Yeah, that's right. These are,
yeah,
absolutely. They're all over the place, but it's not like that up here. Spitfire? What's Spitfire doing up here? And it was a two-seater that's operating out of Kemble. They're everywhere.
Right, let's get through these questions because we haven't got much time left. Douglas says there was or is a big exhibition at RF Dugsford Imperial War Museum about Polish fighter pilots. Many of them were proud of that national background as a lot. Or rather, I think we mean proud of that background a lot of what suppressed or underplayed during the Cold War, particularly before the solidarity strikes in Gdansk in the 1980s. I think this is where we're talking about earlier when we start, when my expansive or multiple question I asked, we talk about, getting that information during the Cold War, and obviously things have changed enormously since, haven't they?
Oh yeah, that's it. It's just a different situation now. I mean, as we discussed, it was very much kept underground and very low profile. Whereas now, we are able to promote and celebrate and commemorate the Polish contribution, which was impossible to do before 1989, before the wall came down. Yeah.
Douglas goes on to say, Jeffrey Wellam's autobiographical book, First Light, paints a really interesting story of training as a Spitfire pilot and his combat experience in them.
Yeah, it did. Jeff was a wonderful man as well. And First Light, his memoir, is, I think, one of the best that came out of the war in recent years. And I wrote a chapter about Jeff in the final few, published by Amberley in 2015. And I went to see Jeff a few times, and we went out and had Sunday lunch down in Cornwall several times. But because of the success of First Light, I did tell Jeff's story because I've got the facts, whereas when you're writing from memory, it can be a bit skewed. But what I really wanted to do was, my friend Matthew Whiteman had initiated and directed the BBC Two docudrama First Light, which came out in 2010. And Sam Heughan, who's now very famous as Jamie Fraser in Outlander, he played Jeff Wellam. And if you've not seen it, you can get the DVD, watch it. It's brilliant. Really, really good. I thought Matt did a great job. And it's great. And in actual fact, I'm talking about this at the Imperial War Museum, London, 15th of March. It's Mother's Day, but try and sneak out because we're doing a day about war films at the Imperial War Museum.
That'd be cool.
So I'm talking about the Battle of Britain on the big screen. But anyway, all right. Well, it's all being put together at the moment, but I've been asked to. So, but that docudrama is really good, and it brings Jeff's book to life. And what I absolutely love about it is Jeff's actually Jeff is there talking, and he's saying some amazing things like the Spitfire gets into your soul, and things like and you want me to forget the Battle of Britain? How can I forget being a Spitfire, an 18-year-old Spitfire pilot in the Battle of Britain? How can I forget? It's really deeply moving. And of course, there'll never be another program like it because all of the few are now gone, as far as we know. So, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, absolutely agree. First Light, top book.
Excellent. Right. Ron goes on to say, Dilip, your stories are amazing. Thank you. And don't answer this question just yet, Dilip. So I want to read the next question. He says, I love your kitchen. Hold that thought. He's talking about your background. And then
it's not my kitchen.
No, hold on a sec. Hold on. And Steve Hopkin then says, what is your next job on that model making bench?
Well, I don't actually know. I've just painted a 1/6 scale samurai warrior, Lord Toranaga from Shogun, which is a 3D printed figure. He's about this big,
Yeah,
absolutely great figure. And I did a 200mm Henry V the other day, but I haven't done any modelling for a bit actually. I've not been inspired so much lately to do any. I don't know. I've got 3 Coteray Spitfires stacked up in the back there to do that they keep sending me, and I ought to make one of them one day. Maybe I'll do that.
Dilip, I just want to say thank you again for coming on. Please keep writing the books because you're, as they say, such good value for a talk, and you're very engaging. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
That's all right. No trouble.
I'm sure our audience will appreciate it. So just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.